The United States has a law known as the Foreign Direct Product Rule, enacted in 1959. The core principle of this law is that if any U.S. technology is used in a product, regardless of where the product is manufactured, the U.S. government has the authority to ban its sale. This is a quintessential example of a law that an imperialist nation would enact, reflecting the United States' hegemonic stance over the global market. According to Bloomberg, the U.S. government is considering using this law to restrict China's semiconductor industry. Once activated, the companies most affected would be Japan's Tokyo Electron and the Netherlands' ASML, two key players in the semiconductor supply chain. Although Japan and the Netherlands are U.S. allies on the surface, the question arises, why is the U.S. willing to stab its own allies by invoking this law? Today, let's examine a report published by Washington Center for Strategic and International Studies, in collaboration with the Federal Reserve, titled The Impact of U.S. Chip Regulations on Domestic Businesses. This report, spanning over 40 pages and containing a wealth of data, concludes that the damage to U.S. companies due to these measures manifests primarily in two areas. First, the decline in sales can be broken down into direct and indirect impacts. The direct losses stem from Chinese companies that were once clients of U.S. firms, but, due to being added to the export control list, are no longer able to do business with them. On the other hand, the indirect effects involve companies that are not on the list, including companies outside of China. Fearing they might be added to the list in the future, these companies have also started to cut ties with U.S. firms, actively decoupling from them. This has led to a broader than expected range of damage, extending beyond Chinese firms to international companies, all of whom are now looking for new chip suppliers. An even worse outcome has been that after losing Chinese clients, U.S. companies have found themselves unable to replace them with new customers. According to the Federal Reserve's latest data, affected U.S. businesses have seen significant declines in revenue, profitability, bank credit, and employment. In other words, the Chinese market is irreplaceable. While it was once assumed that the U.S. was too large a market to lose, we now realize that China is, in fact, the largest consumer market in the world. The loss of this market not only affects revenue potential, but also triggers more serious consequences, like the scaling back of production. In economics, it's well known that larger production scales lead to lower costs and greater price advantages. Thus, scaling up production is the preferred method to reduce costs. U.S. manufacturing already has high costs, and with the loss of China as a customer, companies are forced to scale down production, which in turn reduces competitiveness in the global market. This aspect was also underestimated by the U.S. government. For example, in May 2023, China identified a security vulnerability in Micron technology and used this as a reason to ban the sale of most of Micron's chips. This single measure caused Micron's revenue to plummet by 49%, resulting in significant losses. China's second countermeasure was to provide funding to encourage local companies to innovate and develop chips. According to the Federal Reserve's report, the U.S. government is helping China achieve this goal. Restricted Chinese companies have already found local chip suppliers, and without the chip ban, these companies would likely have continued to purchase U.S. chips. This is a classic case of shooting oneself in the foot, as the U.S. think tank itself describes it, not my words. The report also mentions that since the trade war began, local Chinese chip suppliers have surged. Export bans have forced Chinese companies to innovate, with a prime example being Huawei and ZTE launching 7nm chips this year. This was something the U.S. government did not foresee, as Huawei had previously relied on Qualcomm chips, which will directly lead to a $10 billion revenue loss for Qualcomm. The report's conclusion is simple. China is the largest chip consumer market in the world, with mainland China accounting for 31% of the global chip market in 2022, not including Hong Kong. Losing this market, U.S. companies will spiral into a death spiral. Now, the U.S. not only hopes to remain competitive, but also seeks to pull its allies into the same predicament. In 2022, President Biden's CHIPS Act allocated $39 billion in subsidies to the U.S. semiconductor industry, with the goal of increasing the U.S. share of the global semiconductor market from 12% to 20% by 2030. However, after 2 years, the reality is that Intel, the biggest beneficiary of the subsidy, receiving $20 billion, still faced a $7 billion loss in 2023, an increase from the $5 billion loss in 2022. TSMC received more than $6 billion in subsidies, but in May of this year, TSMC announced that the cost of chips produced in the U.S. would rise by 30%, and these increased costs would be passed on to customers. This means companies like Qualcomm and NVIDIA will face a 30% price hike. Additionally, TSMC's Arizona chip plant, originally scheduled to begin production in 2024, has been delayed until 2025. In this context, some U.S. experts point out that in order to reach the 20% global market share target by 2030, the U.S. must introduce a CHIPS Act 2.0 by 2026 and possibly more legislation to maintain existing capacity. So, is this path sustainable? When the China-U.S. tech war first started, whether you thought China or the U.S. would win, we now have plenty of data to base our conclusions on. According to this data, China has indeed achieved a phase of victory. I believe this conclusion is objective, and it's the reason the U.S. continues to escalate the situation and incur political costs. As for who will ultimately win, we'll have to wait and see. Looking back at U.S. history, it's not hard to see that the U.S. has always maintained its global dominance by controlling global supply chains and monopolizing key technologies. While the U.S. semiconductor industry has dominated for decades, it has not fully realized that it is now part of an increasingly multipolar global tech landscape. Today, these series of sanctions and export control policies have pushed its technological advantage and integration into the global economy toward a dangerous cliff. More seriously, this chilling effect is rapidly spreading, weakening global dependence on the U.S. market, a fact that is undeniably fatal for the U.S. For instance, the U.S. chip ban on Chinese companies was supposed to be a chess piece to curb China's technological progress, but it has instead become a catalyst for a backlash. Under pressure, Chinese companies have risen to the challenge and quickly caught up, even overtaking U.S. firms in some areas. Companies like Huawei and ZTE have already broken into markets once dominated by U.S. firms like Qualcomm and Intel, achieving remarkable results. The U.S. thought it could stifle China's technological development through chip bans, but it didn't foresee that these bans would become the catalyst for China's independent innovation. Ironically, U.S. actions have not only accelerated the rise of China's domestic tech industry, but also directly pushed other countries to speed up their own semiconductor efforts. Many international companies that once relied on U.S. chips are now accelerating the search for new supply chains or relying on more diversified sources. Even U.S. allies like Japan and the Netherlands are now facing the uncomfortable situation of being forced to choose sides. While the U.S. government pressures them to join in sanctioning China, it overlooks the economic consequences of this coercive approach. Japan's Tokyo Electron and the Netherlands' ASML are increasingly facing market pressures. Although they remain allies on paper, their position in the global market is becoming more precarious. The U.S. government's actions are essentially a case of tying itself up in knots. By using export controls and technological blockades to protect its technological advantage, the U.S. is ultimately jeopardizing its independence and position in the global tech competition. The U.S. once held an undisputed leadership role in the global semiconductor industry, but today, that position is being threatened by its own policies. The competition in the tech industry is no longer just a simple country versus country confrontation, but rather a global game of technological power. By suppressing its competitors, the U.S. thought it could maintain its status as the global tech leader. Yet, it failed to anticipate that this suppression would lead other countries and regions to enhance their own research and development, pushing local technologies forward. China is no longer the country dependent on U.S. technology, but is now playing an increasingly important role in the global tech industry. Whether in semiconductors, 5G communications, or artificial intelligence, China is rapidly catching up and even surpassing in some areas. As global tech competition intensifies, any form of unilateralism and trade protectionism will ultimately fail. If the U.S. government continues to pursue this flawed strategy, it will not only harm its own interests, but also exacerbate the fragmentation of the global tech industry, leading to the decline of the global innovation ecosystem. In this scenario, it will be the countries and companies that dare to break through blockades and push for independent innovation that will seize the initiative in future competition.